At the Kodokan Dojo in San Francisco, a 33-year-old judo master was about to commit one of the greatest acts of arrogance in the martial arts world, When he questioned Chuck Norris's style as unfounded and ineffective, he would learn that true martial arts is built upon fundamental principles. The Kodokan Dojo of San Francisco stood as one of America's most revered temples to traditional Japanese martial arts, where the ancient discipline of Judo was practiced with the same reverence and precision that had been cultivated in Japan for over a century. The polished wooden floors, pristine white walls adorned with calligraphy, and the subtle scent of incense created an atmosphere of profound respect for tradition and the pursuit of martial excellence. Kenji Iron Nakamura was the embodiment of everything this sacred space represented. At 33 years old, standing 5 feet 8 inches with the compact, balanced build of a classical judoka, he moved through the dojo with the kind of controlled precision that only came from decades of disciplined training. His black hair was always perfectly groomed, his traditional white gi immaculate, and his movements so economical that every step seemed choreographed by centuries of Japanese martial tradition. Kenji held the rank of Rokudan 6th-degree black belt, a distinction that placed him among the most accomplished judo practitioners in America. He had earned this rank not through political maneuvering or time served, but through genuine mastery of the art's most sophisticated techniques, and an almost obsessive dedication to preserving the purity of traditional Japanese methodology. Judo is not just fighting system, Kenji would tell his students in English carefully measured by his accent. Judo is way of life, philosophy of perfect balance between mind, body, and spirit. This cannot be learned quickly or changed carelessly. This philosophy had served Kenji extraordinarily well throughout his career. He had been national champion twice, had represented the United States in international competition, and had earned the respect of traditional judo masters both in America and Japan. His technique was flawless, his understanding of classical principles encyclopedic, and his commitment to maintaining the art's traditional integrity absolutely unwavering. But Kenji's dedication to tradition had also created in him a rigid perfectionism that bordered on martial chauvinism. In his worldview, there was Judo, the gentle way, the perfect art, and there were various inferior approximations practiced by people who lacked either the intellectual capacity or cultural background necessary to understand true martial excellence. The dojo where Kenji taught was a reflection of his exacting standards. Every training session began with formal meditation, proceeded through precisely choreographed warm-up exercises, and focused on the careful repetition of classical techniques exactly as they had been taught in Japan's most traditional schools. Students who showed the slightest deviation from proper form were corrected immediately, and anyone who suggested modifications or improvements to classical techniques was politely but firmly educated about the dangers of innovation in traditional arts. Modern fighters think they can improve on 1,000 years of Japanese wisdom, Kenji would say whenever the topic of mixed martial arts or contemporary fighting methods arose. This shows fundamental misunderstanding of what martial arts really means. That Tuesday evening, the dojo was hosting a special seminar about the philosophical foundations of traditional martial arts, featuring several respected masters who would speak about how classical principles could be applied to modern life. The event had drawn martial artists from throughout the Bay Area, all eager to deepen their understanding of the mental and spiritual aspects of their training. Among the evening's featured speakers was Chuck Norris, who had been invited to discuss the integration of different martial arts traditions and how his decades of experience had shaped his understanding of combat philosophy. Chuck's reputation preceded him, not just as a Hollywood action star, but as a legitimate martial artist who had earned black belts in multiple disciplines and had competed successfully at the highest levels of karate competition. Chuck arrived at the dojo dressed in simple black pants and a white button-down shirt, his presence immediately recognizable but characteristically understated. At 73 years old, he moved through the traditional space with obvious respect for its cultural significance, pausing to bow properly at the entrance and removing his shoes with the careful attention of someone who understood the importance of ritual in martial arts practice. Accompanying Chuck were Dr. Jennifer Liu, a martial arts historian who was documenting the evolution of Eastern fighting arts in America, and Robert Kim, a former competitive fighter who now worked as a technical consultant for martial arts films. They had come to the seminar as part of a broader research project about how traditional martial arts had adapted to American culture while maintaining their essential character. Mr. Norris, Dr. Liu explained as they were introduced to the evening's other participants, We're particularly interested in your perspective on how different martial arts traditions can complement each other without losing their individual integrity. Chuck nodded thoughtfully, his eyes taking in the dojo's traditional appointments with obvious appreciation. Each martial art has evolved to address specific aspects of human development. When you understand the principles behind the techniques, you begin to see how they all point toward the same fundamental truths. As the evening's formal presentations began, Chuck listened with respectful attention to the other speakers, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated both his genuine curiosity and his deep understanding of martial arts philosophy. His own presentation, when it came, was a model of humility and insight, discussing how his training in various disciplines had taught him that effective martial arts were less about specific techniques than about understanding universal principles of balance, timing, and mental clarity. Kenji had been observing Chuck throughout the evening with growing skepticism. Here was someone who had achieved fame and recognition without, in Kenji's estimation, demonstrating the kind of deep commitment to traditional methodology that true mastery required. Chuck's approach to martial arts seemed, to Kenji's perfectionist mindset, dangerously eclectic, a mixture of different styles that compromised the purity of each individual tradition. During the question and answer period that followed Chuck's presentation, Kenji raised his hand with the kind of polite formality that characterized all his interactions but concealed sharp criticism. "Mr. Norris," Kenji said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to being heard with respect, "I have great appreciation for your contributions to martial arts popularity in America. However, I must ask about what appears to be fundamental contradiction in your approach." Chuck nodded encouragingly. "Please go ahead. Traditional martial arts, true martial arts, are based on centuries of refined methodology, developed by generations of masters who dedicated entire lives to perfecting single systems. How do you reconcile this with approach that seems to mix different traditions without full commitment to anyone?" The question hung in the air with obvious challenge, though Kenji's tone remained scrupulously polite. Dr. Liu leaned forward with interest, recognizing that this exchange might reveal something important about how traditional practitioners viewed modern adaptations of classical arts. Chuck considered the question carefully before responding. "That's an excellent point, and I think it touches on something fundamental about how we understand martial arts learning. In my experience, when you study different systems deeply enough, you begin to see that they're all exploring the same basic principles: balance, leverage, timing, mental focus. The surface techniques may look different, but the underlying truths are remarkably consistent." Kenji's expression remained polite, but his eyes showed that Chuck's answer hadn't satisfied his concerns. "But doesn't this approach risk losing the, how do you say, spiritual depth that comes from lifetime commitment to single tradition? In Japan, we believe that true mastery requires complete dedication to one way, not sampling from many ways." "I understand that perspective," Chuck replied with genuine respect, "and I think there's tremendous value in the depth that comes from lifetime dedication to a single art. But I've also found that understanding different approaches can deepen your appreciation for the principles they all share." Kenji nodded politely, but his body language suggested that he remained unconvinced by what he viewed as a fundamentally flawed approach to martial arts development. As the formal presentations concluded and the evening moved into informal discussion and demonstration periods, he found himself increasingly bothered by what he saw as the crowd's uncritical acceptance of Chuck's philosophical approach. During a break in the proceedings, Kenji approached Chuck with the kind of respectful formality that Japanese martial culture demanded, but with an underlying agenda that went beyond simple courtesy. "Mr. Norris," he said, bowing properly, "I hope you will not think me presumptuous, but I would be very interested to see how your integrated approach translates into actual technique. Perhaps you would honor us with demonstration." Chuck's expression showed neither surprise nor defensiveness at what was clearly a challenge disguised as a polite request. "I'd be happy to participate in any way that would be helpful to the group." "Excellent," Kenji said, his tone maintaining perfect courtesy, while his eyes revealed satisfaction at having maneuvered Chuck into a position where his theories would have to be tested against traditional methodology. "Perhaps we could explore some basic principles of leverage and balance? I am always curious to see how different training approaches handle fundamental concepts." Dr. Liu immediately recognized the significance of what was developing and discreetly signaled Robert to begin recording. This kind of spontaneous demonstration between masters from different traditions was exactly the type of interaction their research was designed to document. Within minutes, The dojo's central mat area had been cleared and the other seminar participants had gathered around to observe what promised to be an illuminating exchange between two very different approaches to martial arts mastery. Kenji prepared for the demonstration with ritual precision, adjusting his gi, checking his belt, and performing a brief series of traditional warm-up movements that showcased the kind of technical perfection that had made him a national champion. Every gesture was economical, balanced, and executed with the kind of flawless form that only came from decades of obsessive attention to detail. Chuck's preparation was markedly different. He simply stood quietly in the center of the mat, doing gentle stretching movements that looked more like meditation than athletic preparation. His breathing was even, his expression calm, and his posture relaxed but alert. "What would you like to explore?" Chuck asked, his tone indicating genuine interest in learning something from the exchange, rather than proving anything about his own abilities. Kenji's response revealed the depth of his confidence in traditional methodology. "Let us begin with most basic principle of judo, using opponent's force against them. This is foundation of gentle way, but requires perfect understanding of leverage, timing, and balance." "An excellent choice," Chuck agreed. "Those are indeed fundamental principles that apply across all martial arts." Kenji moved into a classical judo position, his stance demonstrating textbook form that would have satisfied the most traditional Japanese masters. "Please attack as you would normally. I will demonstrate how proper judo technique can neutralize any aggressive force through superior understanding of physics and human movement." Chuck approached with respectful caution, engaging with Kenji in what appeared to be a straightforward grappling exchange. Kenji immediately attempted to apply one of his most perfected techniques, a hip throw that he had performed thousands of times in competition and practice. But something unexpected happened. As Kenji committed to the throw, applying perfect classical form and timing, Chuck seemed to simply disappear from the technique. Not through dramatic movement or athletic escape, but through such subtle adjustment of position and balance that Kenji found himself throwing empty air, while Chuck remained standing beside him, perfectly centered and apparently unaffected. "Interesting," Kenji said, his confidence momentarily shaken but his determination intensified. "Let me try different approach." This time, Kenji employed a more sophisticated strategy, using grips and positioning that should have given him complete control over Chuck's movement and balance. His technique was flawless, exactly as it had been taught by generations of Japanese masters, executed with championship-level precision and power. Again, Chuck seemed to neutralize the attack not through strength or dramatic counter-technique, but through positioning and timing so subtle that most observers missed exactly what had happened. Kenji's perfect classical technique found nothing to work against, leaving him extended and temporarily off balance while Chuck remained in perfect equilibrium. For the third attempt, Kenji abandoned his teaching mode and began fighting with the intensity that had made him a national champion. He employed a rapid series of classical judo techniques, each one technically perfect, each one flowing smoothly into the next according to traditional combination patterns that represented centuries of refined tactical thinking. Chuck responded to this increased intensity not with matching aggression, but with what appeared to be effortless adaptation. He seemed to read Kenji's intentions before they were fully formed, responding to attacks that hadn't quite been launched yet and maintaining perfect balance regardless of what classical techniques were being applied against him. After several minutes of this increasingly one-sided exchange, Kenji stopped, breathing harder than someone of his conditioning should have been after what appeared to be a relatively gentle practice session. "I don't understand," he said, his voice carrying genuine confusion rather than defensiveness. "Your technique, it is not classical form, not following established patterns." But somehow, Chuck's expression showed only respectful attention, no trace of triumph or condescension. "Your judo is genuinely excellent, Kenji. Your form is textbook perfect, and your understanding of classical principles is obvious." "Then how?" "You're applying classical principles exactly as they were taught to you," Chuck explained patiently. "But you're applying them against an opponent you expected to encounter, not the opponent who was actually standing in front of you." Kenji looked confused, so Chuck continued. "Traditional judo teaches perfect principles, leverage, balance, timing, using force against itself. But I think you've been trained to apply those principles in specific, predetermined ways rather than adapting them to whatever situation actually presents itself." The insight hit Kenji like a revelation. For all his technical perfection, for all his mastery of classical forms, He had been practicing martial arts as if it were a series of precise mechanical operations rather than a fluid response to constantly changing circumstances. But traditional technique, Kenji began. Traditional technique is perfect, Chuck agreed. But technique without understanding becomes ritual. Understanding without adaptation becomes dogma. The principles your classical training taught you are absolutely correct. I was just applying them in ways your specific training hadn't prepared you for. Dr. Liu stepped forward, recognizing that she was witnessing something remarkable, not a victory of one system over another, but a demonstration of how deep understanding could transcend stylistic boundaries. What we just saw, she said carefully, illustrates something fundamental about the relationship between traditional training and adaptive application. Both approaches were using the same principles, but I was following rules, Kenji said quietly, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. And Chuck-san was following principles. Chuck nodded with evident respect for Kenji's insight. Your classical training gave you an incredibly solid foundation in those principles. But somewhere along the way, the training became about executing perfect technique rather than understanding why the technique works. Kenji stood in the center of the mat, his worldview undergoing the kind of fundamental reassessment that only comes from encountering something that challenges everything you thought you knew. For years, he had equated technical perfection with martial mastery, believing that precise execution of classical forms represented the highest level of understanding. In Japan, Kenji said slowly, we are taught that changing traditional technique is disrespectful to masters who came before. I agree completely, Chuck replied. I would never suggest changing traditional techniques, but understanding why they work allows you to apply the same principles in situations that traditional training might not have specifically addressed. The distinction was subtle but profound. Chuck wasn't advocating for modification of classical technique, but for deep enough understanding of underlying principles that those techniques could be applied adaptively rather than mechanically. Over the following hour, as the seminar moved into its final phase, Kenji engaged Chuck in extensive discussion about the relationship between traditional training and adaptive application. What emerged was a picture of martial arts learning that honored traditional methodology, while recognizing that true mastery required understanding principles rather than simply memorizing techniques. I think, Kenji said as the evening concluded, I have been very good student of judo technique, but perhaps not such good student of judo principles. Chuck's response showed the kind of wisdom that could only come from decades of learning from masters across multiple traditions. Traditional training is invaluable because it gives you a perfect laboratory for understanding how these principles work. But the goal isn't to become a perfect replica of your teachers. It's to understand what they understood well enough that you can apply it to any situation. As the seminar participants began to disperse, Kenji approached Chuck with a request that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the evening. Chuck-san, he said, employing the Japanese honorific with genuine respect, would you be willing to teach me? Not different technique, but how to understand principles I have been practicing without truly seeing. Chuck's response exemplified the humility that had characterized his entire approach to martial arts. I think we could learn from each other. Your technical foundation is incredibly solid, probably better than mine in classical judo. But maybe together we can explore how traditional training and adaptive application can strengthen each other. In the months that followed, Kenji's judo underwent a quiet revolution. He maintained all the technical precision and traditional forms that had made him a champion, but he began approaching them as expressions of underlying principles rather than ends in themselves. His competition results improved dramatically, but more importantly, his teaching became more effective as he learned to help students understand why techniques worked rather than simply how to execute them. The video documentation from that evening's seminar became a case study in martial arts education programs throughout the country, not because it showed one style defeating another, but because it demonstrated how deep understanding could bridge apparent contradictions between traditional and modern approaches to martial arts. A year later, when Kenji earned his 7th degree black belt, he dedicated the promotion to what he called the night I learned the difference between knowing technique and understanding principle. Chuck, characteristically, deflected credit for Kenji's growth. He already had everything he needed, Chuck told Dr. Liu when she asked about the transformation she had witnessed. Sometimes we just need someone to help us see what we already know. And sometimes the most profound education comes not from learning new information, but from discovering deeper meaning in knowledge we thought we had already mastered.